All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. This is Geoff with Fluent American checking in once more. Okay, today we're going to be focusing on contractions in English, going over some of the most common ones, and at the end we'll practice. I'll give you some opportunities to see how well you use contractions in your own speech. And the reason we're going over contractions today is this is a topic that I see all the time with my advanced level students, beginning level students. People know them, they're familiar with contractions, but then when they actually need to use them in their speech, they often go missing. I have lots of students, they just don't use them in their own speaking. And if your goal is to sound more native-like, then it definitely is something that you need to incorporate, because one thing you're going to see if you're watching shows or listening to different source of information, you're going to hear contractions all the time. They're extremely common. So if your goal is to sound more natural yourself, you need to use contractions at some point. So we're going to be looking at some of the most common places where contractions appear and then going over some examples. Hey son, thanks for joining us. As always, if you have questions, be sure to let me know, and I'll be happy to discuss. All right, so your most common contractions, I think some of the first ones that students usually learn are contractions involving the verb to be. So whether it's is or are, or other forms that are often get contraction, usually it's going to be your present tense ones. So for instance, to give you an example, our first one here, like he's here, he's here. Notice too that this, when we're talking about contractions, we also, I think it's helpful to also keep in mind stress. So for instance, that first one, when you say he's here, you're not usually going to say it as like he's here, unless you really want to emphasize him. Usually the more important word is going to be here. So notice how that's going to be pronounced. He's here. In a lot of ways, the most clearly heard letter is going to be that s, or even that z sounds like he's. Notice that it's a little bit voiced. So you can feel that vibration in your throat. He's here. So you don't need to say like he's here. It's more he's here. Or for instance, the next one underneath that, they're tired. You don't need to say they're tired. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times in more natural speech, that's going to get reduced more. So instead of saying they're tired, you're more likely to hear they're tired. Just that quick they're tired. How about the next one? I'm happy. And again, if you're reducing it more, instead of saying I'm happy, the more reduced form would just be that I'm happy. This is really kind of, especially holding that M sound. I'm happy. And then the last one, it's easy. And again, for reductions, you could say it's easy. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it's getting reduced more, it's probably going to sound more like it's easy. Just kind of holding that tss. Notice also that linking with it's ending on that tss sound. Easy, starting with the vowel. So they're going to join together. It's easy. Notice, so it's going to sound like seezy. It's easy. Let's read those again one more time. Lots of reductions. He's here. They're tired. I'm happy. It's easy. And of course, if you have questions about that, be sure to let me know. But those are just some common contractions involving the verb to be. Our next group involving contractions with the verb will. So you're going to talk about the future. So for instance, that first one, it'll stop. With it'll, you can use a dark L. Okay, you don't. In fact, with all of these will as contracted forms, you can use a dark L where you're just kind of raising the back of your tongue, lowering the front of your tongue. You don't need to say it'll. It's it'll. You can lower the front of your tongue, raise the back of your tongue. Also note that because for it'll, you have a T that comes before an L sound. What's going to tend to happen is that T is going to take a fast D sound. So it's like it'll. And again, if you're reducing it and you're saying it faster, it's going to sound more like it'll stop. How about our next one underneath that? We'll visit. We'll. You can also say we'll. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll. In fact, that's going to sound just like the part of your car, right? We'll visit. That's fine, but I think oftentimes in reduced speech, you're going to be a little bit more likely to hear like we'll visit, we'll visit. Same thing with our next one up top. He'll talk, he'll talk. You can also pronounce it as heal, heal. This is a long vowel. The E sound on he is a long vowel. And when you link long vowels with L's, remember, they're going to break into two parts. So it's like heal, heal. So it's like eel, eel. Add in the slight sound before the L. So for instance, heal, talk. But again, if it's reduced, it's not being stressed on he, you're stressing more talk, then it's probably just going to sound more like he'll talk, he'll talk. And same thing, of course, with the last one. They'll work, they'll work. So the reduced forms be sounding more like they'll work. But you could also say they'll work, but probably more likely to hear they'll work. So again, all of these forms, especially in the reduced pronunciation, will be it'll stop, we'll visit, he'll talk, they'll work. Again, it'll stop, we'll visit, he'll talk, they'll work. And again, if you have questions on those reductions, be sure to let me know. Also, some reminders, if you're interested in this, you want to get more practice, you want to make sure you're pronouncing these words correctly. We do things like this every single day in our Telegram group. That's that middle option you can see there. If you want to join us, just take a look at patreon.com/fluentamerican, and it'd be great to have you in our group. Let's now look at some contractions involving the word would. So what typically happens is you just keep the D. Okay. In terms of form, it's going to look the same as contractions involving had. So for instance, our first one here up top on the left, I'd ask. We get some linking here. Notice that ask starts with the A, so that D is going to link onto the A. It's like dask, I'd ask. If you want to stress the I, it would sound more like I'd ask. But if you're stressing ask, it's going to sound more like I'd ask. How about the next one underneath that? You'd go. Notice too, you're not going to say you'd, pause, go. You're going to link the D and the G a little bit. You'd go. Don't release the breath after the D. Release the breath after the G. You'd go. So it's not you'd go, it's you'd go. And if you're stressing the go, you'd go. If you're stressing you'd, it'd be you'd go. So again, compare. Stressing go, it would sound like you'd go. Stressing you'd, it would sound like you'd go. How about our next one up top on the right? He'd rather not. And again, that's how it would sound, especially if you're stressing not. He'd rather not. If you want to stress he'd, it would sound like he'd rather not. And again, your full form could, of course, be he would rather not. But again, the contracted form is probably just going to be a much more common. And how about the last one? They'd sleep. You could also say they would sleep, but we use our contraction. They'd sleep. So again, let's read all of those again, stressing the verbs or nots. So for instance, I'd ask. You'd go. He'd rather not. They'd sleep. So again, stressing those last parts. Common contractions with would. Another verb that often gets contracted is the verb to have or has. Okay. Take a look here at our first one. I've gone. And make sure when you're saying this I've and things like that, just make sure your throat's vibrating. What a lot of students tend to do is they pronounce it more like an F sound, like I've versus I've. See if you can feel that. And again, when you're making that contact for that V sound, just make sure your top tooth right here is making contact with the inside of your lower lip. So you want contact like right here. That's where you want your contact with your lip. Okay. So that first one again, I've gone. Stressing gone. I've gone. How about the one underneath that? We've heard. And the next one, they've eaten. Instead of saying they have eaten, you can say they've eaten. And again, last one, she's left. And again, this is just a common thing you want to watch out for, because I'm wondering how many of you it's common to use more of the full form. So instead of saying I've gone, how how likely are you to say I have gone? Or for the next one, instead of saying we've heard, how likely are you to say we have heard? And things like that, So these contracted forms, just really start paying attention to them in your noticing, and also kind of question your own speech a little bit. How are you saying these? And in fact, some students, even when I'm studying contractions, we'll be studying this stuff, but then when it's their turn to speak, they still use the full form. They still say like I have gone instead of I've gone, or they'll still say she has left instead of she's left, and things like that. So try to catch yourself. It might be good to record yourself just to see if you're actually using a contraction or not, because you may still be using the full form. Quick note too for the last one, like for the she's left. Notice that S on she's is going to typically be a little bit voiced, so you want to make sure your throat's vibrating. She's left. Next one, so we got some negative long contractions here. Shouldn't have and couldn't have. Okay, so instead of saying should not have or could not have, these are just some other options that you're likely to hear in speech. So for instance, that first one, I shouldn't have left. Notice that shouldn't have. You really not really releasing the breath until the very end. Shouldn't have or couldn't have. I shouldn't have left. Or that second one, they couldn't have called. And the last one, we shouldn't have driven. You can, of course, say we should not have left, they could not have left, or we shouldn't have driven. You can use the full forms, but I think you also will hear these in speech and things like that. I shouldn't have left, they couldn't have called, we shouldn't have driven. Also, some more contractions we're using had. So for instance, the first one, I'd left. Or the next one, she'd slept. And again, these are going to look the same as contractions using would. Okay, in terms of looks, they look exactly the same. But notice that we're using a past participle after these. So that's how your listener is going to know, does this mean had or does this mean would? Well, your listener is just automatically going to know based off the past participle, like the laughed, the left, the slept, the talked. This shows to your listener that you're using had, you're using the past perfect. Okay. So for instance, they'd laughed, we talked. Let's read those again. Notice the stress typically falling on the participle. It's like I'd left, she'd slept, they'd laughed, we'd talked. Again, I'd left, she'd slept, they'd laughed, we'd talked. Let's read those again now. I'm stressing the contraction. I'd left, she'd slept, they'd laughed, we'd talked. Also, for question words, it's common with question words to also attach them with verbs for contractions. So for instance, instead of saying when are you coming, which is fine, there's nothing wrong with that, you may also hear when are you coming? And typically, again, that stress is going to fall on the last part, right? So it's not usually, it's not usually going to be when are you coming? It's when are you coming? Instead of when are you coming? How's the next one? What have you done? Instead of what have you done? It's a lot of times it's going to be what have you done? And how about that next one? That'll work. That'll. And again, you get that fast D sound on the last T because again, it's before an L sound. It's like that'll work. And same with the next one too. What do you do? Okay. Like instead of saying what will you do, you can just say what do you do? So let's just read those again. When are you coming? What have you done? That'll work. What do you do? Okay, so really quick here, we're just going to kind of practice and review everything that we've just discussed. And of course, if you have questions, you can let me know in the chat box. But our last little major activity here, you're going to see some questions or some sentences here. They're written in full form. And I want to see if we can make these into contractions. So how about this first one? What is your problem? How would you make this into a contraction? Give you a moment to kind of practice on your own a bit. What is your problem? And your contraction will be what's your problem? Notice the stress typically on problem. What's your problem? What's your problem? How about our second one? We have he would go. He would go. What will our contracted sentence sound like? Give you a couple moments just to think about that. Yep, and Sun got before for what, so that's perfect. Any ideas again for this one? He would go. He would go. This one, you're going to contract the would, so it's going to turn into he'd. He'd go. He'd go. And one thing you want to pay attention to when you're saying this, he'd go. You want to make sure that between the D and the G that there's no breath. It's not he'd go, it's he'd go. Don't release the breath until after the G. Okay, he'd go, he'd go, he'd go. The next one, so we have how, are, and they. Sun's doing great. How are they? What are we going to be contracting here? Take a moment to think about that. Also make sure you get the sound right. Also think about, reductions and stresses. What's going to be reduced? How's it going to sound? How are they? We are going to be contracting the first two words. So the how and the are. Okay, so what we typically going to say for this one, like how are they? How are they? Notice that it kind of links together again. It's just one word, how are. Just we've been practicing that. It's a little bit weird if you're not used to practicing it. How are they? How are they? And again, you could say how are they. You could, but I think typically in that speech you're going to usually just pronounce like how are they? How are they? Our next one, I will be late. I will be late. How is this going to turn into the contraction form? And also think again about how is it going to sound in terms of the reductions and the stress. So instead of saying I will be late, Sun's been doing great so far. I hope you guys are as well. This is going to contract into I'll be late. I'll be late. And again, you could strengthen that. You could make it more stressed, like I'll be late. I'll be late. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of times in reduced speech, you're more likely to hear I'll be late. I'll be late. And then our last word, last sentence, excuse me, I should not have eaten. I should not have eaten. What's going to be our contraction? So Sun's saying I shouldn't. Don't forget shouldn't have. Shouldn't have. Don't forget that v sound at the end. That's the only thing I would add. You could also say, I shouldn't have eaten. I shouldn't have eaten. There's nothing wrong with that. But you could also contract it a little bit further too. I shouldn't have eaten. I shouldn't have eaten. Okay. And really, that almost becomes like one word. You like shouldn't have eaten. This almost becomes one word because that v sound at the end of have is going to link onto eaten. So it becomes like veeten, veeten. I shouldn't have eaten. I shouldn't have eaten. I shouldn't have eaten. And again, there's nothing wrong if you say I shouldn't have eaten or I shouldn't have eaten or I should not have eaten. All of these are going to be fine. It's going to be personal preference. But again, this is something I would encourage you to kind of start listening for more and trying to use in your own speech a little bit. Yep. So again, if you have interest in contractions or other parts of pronunciation and things like that, I definitely encourage you to check out our classes. You can schedule an appointment with me at fluentamerican.com, and you'll see we're scheduling. You'll see openings that I have, and then, of course, pick a time that works for you. Adjust for your time zone. And, of course, you can also join our Telegram group by patreon.com/fluentamerican to get some more practice. But let's just kind of read through these one last time just for a review. So again, contracting to be, it's like he's here, they're tired, I'm happy, it's easy. Second one, they'll stop, we'll visit, he'll talk, they'll work. Third one, I'd ask, you'd go, you'd rather not, they'd sleep. I've gone, we've heard, they've eaten. Excuse me, she's left. Shouldn't have, couldn't have, I shouldn't have left. They couldn't have called, we shouldn't have driven. In ahead, I left, she'd slept, they'd laughed, we'd talk. When are you coming? What have you done? That'll work. What do you do? And again, we said, what's your problem? He'd go. How are they? I'll be late. I shouldn't have eaten. All right, guys, thank you so much for your time. If you think of some other things related to contractions or other parts of just American English pronunciation or just English or just life, you can feel free to leave a comment and I'll be happy to get back to you as soon as I can. But thank you guys so much. I hope you have a good day, have a good night, have a good afternoon. Thank you, son. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. I really appreciate it. I will see you in a future video coming out tomorrow. Take care. I'll see you in our next one.